Hey there, folks. This is Misadventure here today with the 21st developer diary for my Imperator Rome overhaul mod project, Hegemony. This is the third and final part of a trilogy of developer diaries, all going over Alpha Patch 0.7, which, at the time that this video goes live, has itself now gone live on the Steam Workshop and should be available to download with all of the new content I've been revealing and teasing over the last couple of weeks, including Authority, Cult Influence, the Diplomacy Overhaul, the Religious Developments Tech Tree, the Character and Politics Overhaul, and the Cultural Developments Tech Tree, along with a bunch of other miscellaneous things I've talked about in the previous two videos. All of those things should now be accessible when the new patch is applied and you're playing Hegemony 0.7. Now, this dev diary should hopefully be fairly quick compared to its previous two in the little sub-series, as I just want to go over a couple more miscellaneous things that I have either finished working on since the previous dev diary, or just didn't really get to in the previous dev diaries as they weren't really tied into the core points of those dev diaries, the core themes of those areas of the patch, as well as talking a bit about the sort of 0.7 patching cycle I want to do. A bit of patch support, a couple essentially minor patches to continue adding in some content and cleaning 0.7 up, given just how enormous the scale of this patch is, as well as my general plans to start to phase out the Hegemony Alpha and transition things towards the Hegemony Beta, and some sort of thoughts about that. With all that said, let's go ahead and get going. Now we're going to start off this video with some flag action, as I have a few more flag designs to show off. I previously revealed the new Atenai flag in Dev Diary 20, and since then I've made a few more flags in a similar vein. Also based very much on research and using the classical age Peloponnesian War era coinage as a direct source of inspiration, and as best as possible, essentially trying to create one-to-one recreations of the coin designs. Starting with Atenai's beleaguered neighbor, Megara, who are still using the red and yellow color scheme, and the lyre, the instrument, I don't know exactly how you say it, I think it's pronounced lyre, now with some text around it. This text in ancient Greek basically spells out of the Megadians and on the coin. This design was basically one-to-one with what you're seeing on the flag. Now, if you are watching this on a non-full screen monitor, or God forbid on mobile, I don't know how you watch anything that I make on mobile because I'm playing a strategy game at super high resolution, so good luck with that. But if you manage to do it, you know, hats off to you. Maybe you just watch it for the soothing sound of my voice, in which case, I don't know what world you came from, but please tell me where it is, because I clearly am needed there. So anyways, however you're seeing this, if you are able to squint and see the Megara flag, you'll see that there's now some very finely detailed text arranged in a circle around the design of the instrument. So, very slight change. It's pretty similar to the previous flag, but I think it does look pretty good, and it's very, very accurate to the coin that I'm basing it off of. Next up is Corinthos, who have a very similar flag to what I was going for before. Now the Pegasus is a little squatter. It's kind of a chubby, short Pegasus. Sort of a pony Pegasus, as it were. A ponysus. And there's also now a symbol underneath the ponysus, which is an ancient Greek letter that actually evolved into the Latin letter Q. It's a fun fact. And apparently, classical Corinthos used the single letter as a kind of stand-in to represent the identity of Corinthos. So make of that what you will. The original Q posters, apparently. No wonder Crochyra wanted to rebel from them. But Corinthos and its pink and white color scheme does remain, and I do like this new Pegasus design, just from an aesthetic point of view, you know, letter or no. It just feels a bit more kind of square, which I think makes sense for this kind of design. Anyways, this is the new Corinthos flag. Lastly, and I think with the best success, is the new Argos flag. And this flag goes so hard, I gotta hop into the game here so you get a nice high-definition view in the top left. This is the new Argos flag, and this is a huge improvement over what I was doing before. Now, there's a lot going on with this flag. So we've got the wolf's head, first of all. Then we've got the letter A for Argos, and then two smaller letters underneath, A and I. Don't know if the archives were somehow predicting AI, like ChatGPT, but not entirely sure. Now, the Argos symbology of the letter A is pretty famous, and in vanilla Imperator Rome, their flag actually, I believe, includes some of these elements. It might actually be Invictus that adds that. I can't remember, but many places where Atagos is a playable country in different strategy games, their flag is their more famous Hellenistic design with the large letter A, and then the smaller letters A and I on the left and right above the letter A. That's a more famous design, but it didn't really start that way. This large A with the two smaller letters directly under it is actually the early version of that same design, and it was what was being used during the classical period around the time of the Peloponnesian War. So I have given them their more historically accurate but more obscure version of the AAI letter situation, and I have combined it with the wolf's head. And actually there's a specific Atagaev coin that I found imagery of, which on one hand is, or on one side I should say, of the coin is the large A with the two smaller letters beneath it, and the other side is the wolf's head. So this is actually, this flag is sort of a combination of both sides of the coin put together, because just the letters A and then AI beneath it would look a little too stark, I think. Yeah, no pun intended with that one, with the gray wolf on white background and all that. But just having the wolf's head wouldn't really make it clear that this is based off of a coin, because a lot of these classical Hellenic coins did have text on them. So I thought it'd be interesting to do a kind of creative combination of two sides of the coin, put them together, and now we've got this just concrete hard flag. Like, this flag is hard enough that you could put it on a record and it would play music. So having said that, since we're already looking at Atagos, who actually, if you don't know, is a democracy, let's talk about some of the politics changes that are in 0.7 that are now available because the patch is available, but I didn't talk about previously because they were still in the works. First things first, I've made a number of localization improvements. The government of both democracies and oligarchies now displays on the top here Atacon and then the name of the character. This is dynamic, and it's also highlighted in gold, so it's very easy to read. You know exactly who the character is. In a democracy with your crazy 1-year election cycle, you may need to actually check this on occasion to remember who the current Atacon is. Now, another change I've made is concerning the faction national modifiers, which was not something I actually had finished previously. Essentially, whenever a faction is in power, they actually provide a nationwide modifier that is a mirror of the ruler's attribute effects, although it's not based specifically on the ruler. Essentially, each faction provides the same national modifier that's the equivalent of if the ruler had 5 stats of the attribute that the faction's associated with. A good example here is that the 5 stats of finesse provide 2.50% population happiness, and the 5 stats if the plutocratic faction was in power, they would provide 2.50% population happiness. There we go. Managed to get it in the end. So you can see that this is basically the equivalent of a mid-level kind of average amount of stats, but this is additive with the other modifiers. So for example, here we have this loser zero martial character here, who is providing no martial benefit whatsoever from his actual stats, but because he's in the stratocratic faction, because again, even though he wouldn't normally be in that faction because of the way that the faction's support works, because of a issue with the hard code, every single nation who has the faction starts with a stratocrat ruler. I just can't fix that. I've tried. Even though he is 0 martial, while he's in power, and so the stratocrats are in power, your nation is getting the effect of 5 martial from the stratocratic national modifier. So again, 0.25 morale of armies and navies from stratocratic rule, 2.50% pop happiness from plutocratic rule, minus 0.10 monthly ambition for the whole nation from democratic or aristocratic rule, and 10 dip rep from theocratic rule. Pretty straightforward, but thought I'd note that I've added those in, and this is also the case for both democratic factions and oligarchic factions. Alright, moving on, let's talk about offices, because this is something I didn't talk about in the previous DevDario when I talked largely about governments and politics, because I was still working on the offices system. I now have not just a finished offices system, but a quite interestingly sort of overhauled offices system. Let's take a look at my kind of reworked offices screen here. Now, there's a lot going on the screen. I'll explain it all. First and foremost, just a quick note, whenever you start a campaign, be aware that all of these characters in these offices aren't going to have the loyalty boost that you would normally get from adding a character to an office. So all of them are going to start with loyalty situations that don't reflect being assigned a position in the office. Being assigned an office position, I think, is 15 loyalty, so you actually should probably replace every single person here just so you have a cabinet of officers who are all 15 loyalty higher. But as I'll explain in just a sec, there's actually a lot more going on in how you want to select and think about the composition of your offices. Now, to explain what I've done here, let me first go over the literal mechanics, then I'll talk about the big picture sort of design philosophy of how I've redone offices. And I'll talk as well and show offices in monarchies and tribes as well. Now, in terms of just the direct modifiers, first the obvious ones. You've got the Polematicos and the Navaticos, which means sort of field commander, or what's the term? Yeah, field commanders, right? And then the sort of naval commander, the admiral. Like not like a, like I'm trying not to say like general or admiral because those are positions of people who lead forces. It's sort of like the equivalent of like the chief of staff and like the chief of navy. Like it's more of a grand strategy, kind of position. So, anyways, the first one provides 5% morale of armies modifier per point of the character, right? And remember that we're looking at the character's attribute modified by their statesmanship for the effect it has as an officer. And of course, these points are the result of that. So this character up here has 8 martial, but because of his statesmanship, he actually is only applying 3 martial currently, which results in the 15%, because it's 5% per point, of morale of armies. Next up with the Navaticos, we've got, again, 5% morale of navies per point. Down here in the charisma section, we've got the Pretanis with 0.05 ambition reduction nationwide per point, and the Fez Mothete with 0.05 monthly ruler popularity gain per point. And by the way, these positions are actually named the same as some techs in the cultural developments tech tree, where the institutions of the Fez Mothete and the Pretanes are actually featured and talked about, and the modifiers they give are actually matched up as well. I did this on purpose, even though you could argue it's a little bit kind of illusion breaking to have the development of these institutions happen in the mid-game or late game, and then you have the offices from the beginning. But I'm working with what I can here. I'm making a mod for Imperator Rome, not a game from scratch where I can decide everything. So, at the end of the day, these sort of historical scenarios are to some extent going to have to be flattened a bit, where I'm taking, especially in the developments tech trees, which are chronologically speaking all over the place, I'm taking tons of elements that are not necessarily like linear, because we just don't know. Like, this was thousands of years ago, and a lot of the records we have aren't super specific about how one thing led to another in a way that a linear tech tree can really capture. So having things in the tech tree that pop up from the beginning of the game in other systems is just going to be inevitable. And honestly, I don't think anyone would have ever even worried about that until I brought it up now, so maybe I caused my own problem there, but it is what it is. Either way, I do like that I've managed to think of having the 2 offices that have sort of cultural developments tech tree equivalents use the same modifiers as the tech tree. And they're both good modifiers that reflect the cultural developments tech tree focus on character modifiers. Moving on to the Heliastes and the Nomothetai, who are both your finesse positions. This is 5% tax rate and 5% commerce value nationwide per point. And then finally, we've got the Atticon Basilius with 2 dip rep. I think I may actually buff this in an upcoming patch to be maybe 5 per point instead of 2 per point. Yeah, I think dip rep's a little underpowered here. And 10% improve opinion maximum for the per point for the Theor Odokoi position. Now, having said what all these positions do in terms of their sort of standard officer modifier, you may be wondering what's going on with all of the faction approval modifiers. Well, first of all, it's displaying as 2 for each one because of how the interface works with the way that I've handled factions, where there's 4 democracy factions, then there's 4 oligarchy factions. And essentially, there's 8 factions that every nation only can have 4 of, whether you're an oligarchy or a democracy. So all the times that I use these custom modifiers that I basically coded myself, the game requires me to have both of them be there at the same time. So I note that it's the same with the 8 that appear in Cult Influence, where I mark them as such. So just know that even though it shows it twice, only one of them counts for you, as you don't have a... So for example, playing as a democracy right now, I don't have an oligarchic plutocrat faction to get approval. It just doesn't exist in my country's code. So just wanted to note that. But as for what these are actually doing, essentially every single position, right, because there are 8 positions that are lined up thematically with the 4 attributes, every position has approval gain that scales with the current statesmanship modified attribute, the same way that the impact scales the made modifier. It's scaling with the attribute that is the same attribute that the faction is all about, right? So the stratocrats are all about martial, so you get stratocratic approval for the 2 martial positions, and it's scaling with the impact from the statesmanship modified attribute from the officer. You're getting democratic, and you can actually see here very nicely, democratic approval and aristocratic approval. This is the oligarchy equivalent of the democratic faction for the charisma, same thing down here. You get the idea. Plutocrats like the plutocratic offices, and the theocrats like the zeal offices. Now, this change is actually pretty significant in the way that the politics gameplay is balanced, in that it provides a fairly minor, let's not kid ourselves here, we're looking at, 0.10 to 0.20, maybe at best. I think I've seen anything higher than 0.20, because that's 10 attributes for both of those offices. That's a really good situation. So really, with min-maxing, you're looking at maybe up to 0.20 on average for approval gain from these offices. Now, 0.20 per month is not very much. That's 5 months to get 1 full point of approval. So it's not a game changer, but what it does do is it provides a very slow and very gradual upward trend for all of your approval rates. Now, keep in mind that, as I talked about last time at length, the approval system for factions is meant to be very reactive. It's meant to feel very much out of your control. And so I didn't really add these approval systems for the offices to really dramatically shake up that previously mentioned formula, but rather to create a nice incentive to get a sort of a sensible and kind of appropriate kind of political benefit from the specific thing that an office is doing, what it means for your government, which is divided by factions who all value different things about the state, right? So it just makes sense that having a high zeal Archon Basilius, which is the high priest position, would make the theocrats happier, right? And on top of this being a pretty minor mechanic, one thing it does do is it helps to avoid a situation where you're just stuck at 50 mandate and just waiting for events to kind of shift it around. As if you're always trending up slightly, you actually have perhaps a bit more confidence to take slightly higher approval hits, or maybe even sort of factional mandate hits if you calculate all that stuff on your own, because you know that things will trend back up over time. So I think a very slight trend upwards is actually kind of good for this system, even though the system is not meant to be defined by a trend that you can just rely on all the time. Rather, I want it to give you an option to feel a bit more confident in taking riskier steps. This also does something very nice for cult influence. You can start to see why I took so much time to design 0.7 with the cult influence and politics stuff coming out together instead of designing these 2 sort of separate systems and not connecting them. Because with slowly trending upward Ecclesia mandate gradually, very, very gradually from these approval rates, what this allows for is a little bit of cult influence. You can now safely let a little bit of cult influence start spreading for that happiness bonus. And given your starting happiness situation, it's very called for. So I actually kind of like the fact that on top of making the Ecclesia mandate system a little bit less extreme min-maxy, and it gives you a bit of wiggle room, because then it gives the player a feeling of confidence to do something a little risky, right? It also makes the cult influence system a bit less of a kind of all or nothing thing, where you don't need to fully commit to 0 cult influence at all time. You can now safely let the cult influence in like a little tiny bit. But then, of course, the great thing about the cult influence system is the way to get more cult influence, by and large, aside from doing the festivals. That's not where I live. Here we are. Aside from doing the festivals, where you get little bursts of cult influence, but you can only do these, on timers, and it's per province. But also, this gives you a reason to enter into the religious development's tech tree to get those really, really good early modifiers. Because previously, if you didn't feel confident in managing your cult influence and managing, in particular, the party approval problems that came from it, even entering the religious development's tech tree may have felt a little too daunting, but now you're going to get a little bit of wiggle room to maybe play around a little bit with cult influence. And then you have to enter, of course, that cycle of doing challenge the cults, basically on cooldown. I have a lot of interesting ideas about how I can further refine and balance these systems, not just in general, but also with different difficulty settings. I've avoided getting tangled up in the massive complexity of trying to actively balance everything with different difficulty settings as I go. I want to come back to that later on once all the core systems are basically done, so I can really understand what I'm doing. But I want to make playing this game on normal difficulty be the kind of harder, more engaged experience I've talked about so far, with hard difficulty or very hard difficulty essentially being a genuine challenge mode with really absurd difficulty that's not meant to be balanced, but rather meant to be a really ridiculous thing you have to use really weird strategies to get around, but is not really meant for normal playthroughs. So I'll talk about this more in the future as I work on the difficulty modifiers more. Fortunately for me, given that so many parts of this game are weirdly difficult to code and change, the difficulty modifiers are actually very, very easy to modify, and I have a lot of interesting ways I can change things up. Anyways, so that basically covers the first layer of talking about the new offices system. And I will say just really quick that monarchies and tribes for now have the same names of everything, even though these names are very Athenai specific. Again, we only really have a good primary source history about Athenai and their government. We have some about Lacedaemon, but not a ton. The monarchy and tribal offices have the same main modifier, and they don't have any of these approval impacts, because of course these are not going to make sense in the context of monarchies or tribes where there's no factions. And the names are placeholders for them. I will customize the names more later. I just haven't really had the time to do that kind of research. I don't want to delay 0.7 any longer for a very minor kind of visual change when the core gameplay is now set in stone. Right, now another thing I want to mention is that with 0.7's release, I'm intentionally releasing it with a number of systems not active, because I want to take the time to really refine them and really create good support systems. So for example, all of the laws essentially don't do anything. In fact, they literally don't do anything. So you can change your laws as much as you like, but at the moment, these will do 0 things. This is true for all of the Republic laws, all of the tribe laws, and all of the monarchy laws. Now, I wouldn't recommend playing as a tribe right now, or as a chiefdom, which is what my mod calls them, as all of their centralization mechanics aren't going to work, because you can't get centralization from the laws. That being said, there's so many things about the current alpha's events that are all kind of screwed up, so it's kind of difficult to just have a normal playthrough right now with anyone. But especially as a chiefdom, I'd say hold off on that for now. But either way, actually one type of law that does still work is the different succession laws for monarchies are still actually working, but the rest of them have been wiped out, sort of like what I've done here, just for now. I'm going to come back in a sort of a minor patch, like a 0.7x type patch, and I'll do multiple patches like this to basically add back in laws for all the different kinds of governments. And I've also removed, although these have been actually disabled for a little bit now, all of the modifiers from the priorities, as I want to completely rework this from scratch with the same idea of having these priorities you can switch between freely, but with a completely different set of modifiers, because now the original priority system from like half a year ago is completely out of date. It had tons of modifiers that weren't balanced with the tech trees that I made later, and it involved things like stability that I just removed from the game. So I have to kind of start from scratch. It's perfectly fine. I've also reduced the number of priorities down from 9 to 8. So I will continue working on this system and release the priorities sort of back into the game. For now, if you do want to play the game, you can still just set up 4 priorities. They don't do anything, but you can still set them up to get your 1 monthly authority so that you're not running out of authority immediately. Now, another thing that I have done is I've removed all of the alignment modifiers, which also need to be basically fully revamped from the beginning. And I want to make sure that all the, did I say alignments? The policy modifiers, I guess they are alignment related, but the policy modifiers, both in terms of their core modifier and their focus modifier or their emphasis modifier, have all been basically scrubbed to be nothing, so all of these policies don't do anything. I'm basically going to rework this whole system, not rework the system, but add in rework all of the policies in the system. There we go, because the system is actually good. I just want to start from scratch with new policies and really reconsider what kinds of things these policies might represent. You may also notice a few instances where I've actually cleaned up the interface. I've removed the Holy Sites tab over here because there's no longer a Holy Site system. I'll remove the text as well. I forgot to do that. I've also gone over to the Military tab and removed the Traditions, which I had renamed to Ambitions system. I've also renamed the Legion system to Mare, that there's more localization to do. I'll get to all that in the future. I've also modified the levy size multiplier for everybody to 30% from 25%, just so you have a few more units to work with. And I think that's basically all of the main updates from the previous dev diaries that I didn't get to yet. If I've not mentioned it, I've also removed all the modifiers from the economy tab. This is another thing I want to add in. Basically, now that 0.7 is done, I need to take a break because I've been working on this patch for what feels like my entire life. But once I come back, I want to basically start adding back in the systems that support the entire game set of mechanics, now that all of the core mechanics are reworked and sort of ready to be modified, as it were. So the economy stuff, all the alignment stuff, all of the laws, these are all things, and the priorities as well, these are all things that kind of modify and change core mechanics. Now that all the core mechanics are done, I'm ready to kind of come in and make all those changes and add all those modifiers in. Right, with all that said, one more thing to note is that the paradigm system has 2 finished paradigms, the Misc paradigm and the Philosophia paradigm, with working effects. I've checked that these work, and they do work. And by the way, most city-states are not going to need to advance through Philosophia too much. This is the paradigm that gives you more research capacity at the cost of some malices in the first couple of ones. But if you're playing as a very densely populated, very high Adastoi and Polites rate city-state like Athenai, you actually, based on my own playtesting, once you have all of the economic developments, happiness modifiers, and research bonuses for your population, you actually do need to have all of the Philosophia paradigm levels unlocked in order to have enough MRC, max research capacity. This in total adds up to 400%, which is added onto 100% default. So you end up with 500%, and based on my own playtesting with Athenai, I was able to give myself enough innovations through just using the console to do playtesting to make sure that I gave all of my pops as many happiness modifiers as you can get just from the tech tree, and I ended up somewhere in the 400% range, so like above 400%. So actually having a 500% max research capacity like modifier going sounds kind of extreme, but it's actually necessary once you really, really min-max a very good population for research purposes. But for most playable countries, you're not going to really need to advance Philosophia too quickly. Now, to quickly talk about the modifiers, Socrates is first. He provides 100% more max research capacity at the cost of 10% population happiness, and this does actually hurt research because population is where research is coming from, so you're going to notice a short-term loss in research, but you can get more in the long term with that max research capacity boost. Platon is reducing your monthly authority by 1, so probably don't want to get this guy until you have at least some sources of authority that are reliable, but this does give you more max research capacity. And Aristoteles is providing just 2 sets of 100% max research capacity to get you to 500%. And these 2 modifiers can never be sort of undone, so you have to just kind of power through. Although I should note that they're both counteracted by very easy text to get. Pop happiness 10% is the inverse mirror of getting Demote over here. And 1 monthly authority is the inverse mirror of getting Dodecatheon over here. So you are able to counteract them, but they're basically just bringing down modifiers that you're likely to have early on anyways. As for the actual text, you're welcome to just read it in your own copy of Imperator Rome with Hegemony active, but basically, I'm going to read it. I'm proud of my writing here. Philosophia, the glories and horrors of the Peloponnesian War inspired unprecedented self-reflection among the Hellenes, who saw firsthand that the gods, so often ascribed as the authors of great wars, took no part any longer. This brought about the uncomfortable idea that perhaps they were not only absent from all wars, but that they never existed in the first place. So this paradigm is meant to represent the development of philosophia, or philosophy, in this period. This is a scenario, or this is like a situation that happens basically as the Peloponnesian War is ending, and sort of in the very last couple decades of the Classical Age until the Hellenistic Age begins, as the final of this sort of line of three sort of student-teacher pairs, which is Aristoteles, is the actual tutor of Alexander the Great, who sort of starts the Hellenistic Age with his actions. So first things first, we've got physiologoi. For hundreds of years, reflection on the deeper works of the world and the meaning of it all was associated with the physikoi, teachers of physiologoi, the study of nature. Their observations had ample place for the gods and their workings. Then, once you have a available paradigm shift, you can grab Socrates. Philosophia, the love of wisdom, truly began with the Athenian Socrates. While no politician himself, Socrates married the daughter of the oligarchic Aristides, and his teachings reveal a serious skepticism of democracy. That's putting it lightly, by the way. I don't think Socrates was the biggest fan of Atenae's very unusual political arrangement. I'll talk a bit more about the big picture revelation that I had about these very foundational philosophers in a moment. Next up is Platon. Born Aristocles and later known by the nickname Platon, which means wide, the famous Athenian student of Socrates focused on existential themes and deconstructing the tradition of classical Hellas, especially democracy. Finally, his student Aristoteles. Aristoteles of Stagira, a student of Platon, completed the trajectory of anti-democratic thought by disavowing the system altogether, foreshadowing the Hellenistic Age and the reemergence of great Hellenic monarchies. So, even though Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are often seen as these like towering figures of philosophy, they kind of happen very quickly in the span of time, right? You've got Socrates, who's actually a citizen of Atenae during the Peloponnesian War and may have actually been like in a position of political power. It's a little hard to tell from the records. It's not like Thucydides, where Thucydides was definitely like a strategos or a general for some period of time. Socrates, it's complicated because basically everything we know about Socrates as a historical figure comes from Plato, who makes him the protagonist of all of his writings. And so we have sort of two Socrateses that we know are not exactly the same. We've got Plato's character of Socrates, who is very sort of stoic and very wise, kind of unbelievably wise and intelligent, basically this perfect mentor figure who just understands how to puzzle out the complexities of the world and basically is a mouthpiece for Plato's own philosophy. Then we have the historical real person Socrates that Plato was a real life follower of, who may or may not have had the characteristics of Plato's character of Socrates. And so a lot of the things that are famous about Socrates, like his sort of antagonistic relationship to the people of Atenae, like the mad gadfly, philosophy was my invention, as they say in the epic rappel of history with him. Like these are ideas that come from Plato, and they may or may not be true about the historical figure. Now, something I find very interesting about Socrates as a historical figure is that he seems to have actually been an oligarch, or had sort of oligarchic leanings, at a time where in Atenae that was essentially inviting an accusation of treason. So he marries the daughter of Aristides, who's this big oligarch, and his teachings in Plato have a very clear anti-democracy or kind of like democracy skeptical leaning, right? And he's also executed by the state. Famously, he's forced to drink hemlock as a form of execution for allegedly impiety, but also sort of because of his association with the oligarchic period of Athenai after Athenai loses the war. The Lacedaemonians, like they actually did a little earlier in history when they threw out the first Athenian oligarchy. It's complicated history, but basically after the Peloponnesian War, Athenai loses. Lacedaemon installs this big tyrannical oligarchy that only lasts for a very short time. But in that time, Socrates apparently buddies up with them and is pretty friendly with them. And then when the democracy is reestablished, right? It's not just that it's back to business as usual. The new democratic Athenai is like reactionary democracy. It's sort of like, you know, the French Revolution, where they're basically on the hunt for anyone that was supporting the oligarchs or who are seen as too pro-Lacedaemon. And not that I would necessarily blame the Athenians for, you know, having kind of a lot of energy, you know, and vim and vigor when they're reestablishing their democracy, but it gets a little out of hand, and they basically accuse Socrates of being this kind of oligarch supporter and for being impious, which, according to Plato's account of him, he 100 billion% was impious. Like, there's no getting around that. Guilty as charged. But either way, Plato, in his writings, obviously is famous for his existentialism, talking about the allegory of the cave, lots of really interesting themes. Plato wrote a book called Republic, or that's the English name of it, and I encourage all of you to read this book because it is the most wild thing you would have never expected, like a super famous, austere philosopher would have created, because it presents a perspective on like the purpose of the state that is so weird and yet so specific to the period that Plato was writing, right? So basically, not to go into a giant tangent about the Republic, but Plato's Republic, in short, is, like a lot of his writings, sort of presented as a Socratic dialogue. That's where we get the term from, where Socrates and a bunch of other people who were possibly real people, possibly fictional characters, it's sort of hard to tell, are all talking about politics in Athenai. You know, what else do they talk about? And basically, it's this giant conversation that evolves into this long explanation of a sort of utopian society that Plato thinks would be really great. And it's interesting because the republic that Plato describes is very undemocratic, right? Now, I'm a political science major from college. I'm a lawyer. I find politics and law really interesting, obviously. These are obviously enormous themes of this mod that I've put a lot of my own interests into. So the Republic being this book that's about essentially politics and law, what's so interesting about it is that Plato basically describes this argument against democracy, basically saying that every person has like a very specific place in society. And in fact, he describes it as everyone has a soul that has a different kind of material. Like, it's not meant to be a literal, but it's meant to be more of like a metaphor to explain the nature of human difference. But he basically says, like, there are like bronze, silver, and gold souls, and everyone's sort of predestined purpose for the polis, for the society, needs to be respected by the structure of society. So his big argument is that essentially a like a good society is ruled by a gold-souled philosopher king, who is essentially this enlightened authoritarian ruling over a tyrannical society where oh my gosh, my throat's closing up. Anyways, ruling over this tyrannical society, tyrannical by our standards, where there's no democracy, there's no popular choice. Instead, everyone is following the edicts of the philosopher king who has true wisdom. And people are in different castes based on the quality of their soul. Now, this is I'm recounting this book that I read a long time ago, so I may be getting things a little like off here and there. I'm not saying this is a one-to-one correct sort of rendition of the book, but my point is that Plato's Republic is so interesting because mostly because of what it reveals about Plato's political views about his current world, right? Plato is living in the aftermath of the Athenian loss of the Peloponnesian War, the period of the tyrants, the reestablishment of the democracy, and essentially Athenai goes back to business as usual. They basically try to kind of go back to how things were before the Peloponnesian War, but that ship has sailed, literally, where now you've got the Lacedaemonian hegemony, and pretty soon the Theban hegemony starts, right? So Athenai's like time in the sun is over, and for a lot of Athenians who survived the Peloponnesian War to see this, I imagine it kind of felt like Atenai screwed it all up just through their own actions, which is, incidentally, I think true. Like, I think Atenai could have maintained their hegemony over, like, the Hellenic world for a much longer time if they just kind of were a bit more subtle about their imperialism. Not that I'm trying to give advice to anyone to go be imperialistic successfully, right? I mean, Atenai's imperialism was morally evil. Like, let's not kid ourselves, because of all the harm it did. But Atenai could have definitely, like, handled this a lot better. But they basically were so unconcerned with following the political norms of classical Hellas that they kind of screwed it up all by themselves. Anyways, that's a much longer conversation to kind of contemplate about that. But the point is that Plato, in his time and place, right, in the aftermath of all these things that have happened, basically has this very cynical, very anti-democratic perspective that he sort of expresses through the words of the character he makes of his teacher. And this philosophy, which is central to a lot of his political writings, right, and even to some extent his existentialism, really influences his foremost student, Aristotle, who basically, in his own philosophy, just directly says democracy is actually not very good, and it's the worst version, like the corrupted version, of essentially what would later become known as a republic, where Aristotle says there should be layers of representation, sort of layers of, kind of meritocratic leadership that separate, like, the people from direct power. Again, I'm not directly quoting Aristotle here, but that's, like, the gist of a lot of his writings about politics. And this mindset doesn't necessarily even require those people to be popularly elected. Aristotle, in a lot of his writings, is basically completely fine with monarchy, even tyranny, and he goes and lives in Macedon, where he's born. I mean, he wasn't born in Macedon. Stagira is a independent city-state when Maimad begins, but by the time of Aristoteles, I think it was under Macedonian rule. He's often called a Macedonian anyways, but he's from the Macedonian area, so he's really involved in Macedonian politics to some extent, which is obviously a monarchy. And his philosophies directly influence Alexander the Great, one of his students, who goes on to conquer the planet, basically, from the perspective of the Hellenes. So I think it's very interesting, actually, that in the course of these philosophers, you see this trend of this sort of collapsing confidence in democracy, where, because of their material conditions, to bring out the big terminology, they basically see their institutions failing them and start to talk about alternatives. And the reason I find this so interesting is that that's happening today in America and in much of the world. People today see their institutions failing them and are looking for alternatives to democracy. Now, I'm not saying that we're making our way towards Macedonian-style monarchy in modern-day America, but I think there's an interesting parallel between the way that in this ancient period, these very smart people basically started to lose confidence in something that we often consider just kind of flatly positive. Popular democracy is, I think, deservedly so, very much praised and very much seen as a completely positive thing. I think it's more complicated because in the time of Atenai, classical Atenai, this kind of democracy, first of all, was very exclusive to a tiny part of the population, right? We're talking about adult men who are not slaves. That's most of the people not counted there. But even for that group of people, there were all these caveats, right? Even if there weren't institutional caveats the way that a republic works, there were practical caveats, right? You had to be physically in Atenai, in the Agora, for the direct democracy, and there's only so many people that could fit in there. So if you were living in the countryside, doesn't matter. There's no vote by mail, right, in classical Atenai. You're literally in the crowd for the assembly, or you're not, right? So it's not hard to find criticisms of the system, so I don't necessarily think that this is some problem with these people. I think that rather it's interesting how the reason why this hesitancy with democracy and this kind of curiousness towards tyranny and authoritarianism and ultimately monarchy, because Aristotle's teachings form the basis of the kind of aristocratic, like, enlightened ruler, like, kings are good because they're, like, better than normal people. This mindset that defines Western civilization for 2,000 years after him, right? Like, we've been living in the long shadow of Aristotle's like viewpoints, which are directly coming from these previous people, with the way monarchy has been justified. Monarchy, of course, being a disgusting system that has no place in the world, in the modern world, but the idea of like a enlightened, superior person ruling everybody, that's the philosopher king. That's what Platon was talking about. And monarchies have tried to present themselves as being that for thousands of years because it's intrinsically a good counterargument to democracy. So I just think it's really interesting that, you know, in a time where we in the modern day are faced with such existential problems, right? Like our climate's collapsing, we've got just massive resurgence of political violence, just enormous destruction of society thanks to social media and the role of mass media, like enormous problems that we may not ever be able to come away from and you know, restore what we thought we had. But, you know, lots of people today are really entranced by the idea of alternatives to traditional, like, American or Western democratic norms, liberal institutions, you know, kind of neoliberalism, capitalism. And these sorts of existential anxieties were driving these great philosophers thousands of years ago who were in a very different world, in a very different situation, but there are some interesting parallels. I just think it's really interesting to think about that. Like, you know, a lot of the time people think about really great people in history as kind of just happening and they change everything with their actions. But I think there's an argument that these people and their viewpoints were really shaped by the conditions around them and the really unusual strain it put on them to understand and kind of create a narrative, a permission structure to make sense of it all. And I think that, you know, we're living in such an unusual time today that there are the chance for people like these, you know, old guys from thousands of years ago to come up with these really interesting and subversive and even destructive and harmful arguments against what we're used to. So I'm not trying to make any big sweeping statement or anything. I just think there's an interesting parallel here, and this kind of thing makes me love being a fan of history, because I never would have ever thought that I would learn about this weird through line between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle and come to these sort of viewpoints about, hey, maybe there's like a deeper, long arc of history where people actually cycle in and out of their trust in institutions in a way that I never really thought of before. Because the issue of a loss of institutional trust is a huge problem and a huge predicament for modern day, you know, societies and civilizations, which are so driven by institutional structure. And here in this sort of era, I mean, my mod is in many ways trying to simulate the kind of apocalypse that destroyed the institutions of the classical Hellenic world, where after the end of the Peloponnesian War, Lacedaemon and basically everyone tried to go back to business as normal, but everything that they had just taken for granted was gone, right? The normal ways that all the Hellenes got along and solved other problems just couldn't really work anymore. And, you know, once Macedon rises, it's over from there, right? From then on, you never really have the same dynamic in classical Hellas. And I don't know, I know I'm kind of just going off on a big, long tangent that maybe no one really cares about, but I think it's really interesting. And I think that there's a lot to think about when it comes to reflecting on how these different, you know, great thinkers were so much a product of their time, and how, you know, we're living in such an unusual time right now. So maybe there are some great thinkers among us. Maybe it's you. Probably it's not me, but it might be you. Yeah. Anyways, long spiel about a very minor bit of flavor text. But with that said, that's going to wrap up this final part of my trilogy of dev diaries about 0.7. As I said, 0.7 is now live on the Steam Workshop. And in the next dev diary, Dev Diary 22, I'm going to be continuing with more coverage of smaller, minor patches coming out soon. I'll be making like 0.7, you know, 0.1 style and onward patches that are adding in mechanics that I removed in 0.7 as I continue to rework these systems to support my new set of game mechanics and modifiers and whatnot. So that wraps things up for this dev diary. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.